The hearing had been in session for 11 minutes when I realized no one in the chamber intended to listen. I noticed it in the way adjudicator Thien folded his second pair of arms left over right, the tertiary joints locked at a precise 40-degree angle. In Droshari body language, it was the equivalent of closing a door. Not rude, merely final. The posture said, "The conclusion has been reached. The rest is theater, and we are simply waiting for the theater to end so the record can be sealed." I had been watching Thien for 9 days. 9 days of preliminary filings, witness attestations, and procedural review in the Joint Treaty Commission's Hall of Arbitration on Vethon Station, and in all that time his posture had never changed. Arms folded, cranial spines tilted 3 degrees port, a Droshari signal of mild boredom, and those wide obsidian eyes watching the proceedings with the polished disinterest of someone reviewing cargo manifests. My name is not important for this account. What matters is what I was, the senior arbiter assigned to the Terran grievance docket, case 4417, filed under the archaic provision for species-level petition. I was Droshari, 61 cycles old, a career jurist in the Commission's arbitration division. I had presided over 1,400 cases in 32 years of service, trade disputes, border infractions, resource rights claims between minor polities. The Commission existed to resolve disagreements between signatory species through structured arbitration, impartial, procedural, and binding. It was not glamorous work. It was not supposed to be. Case 4417 was a human petition, the first one the Commission had received in 8 standard years, since the suspension of Earth's provisional signatory status following the Vethon Compact reclassification, a polite term for what was, in practice, a collective decision by the 18 senior species to strip humanity of its diplomatic protections. The reclassification had been proposed by the Droshari delegation, endorsed by the Velori trade bloc, and ratified by the full Commission in a closed session that lasted 40 minutes. The humans had not been invited to speak. The grounds were technical. The formal justification cited irregularities in Earth's original accession, filing clerical errors in the Species Capability Index, inconsistencies in the self-reported population figures, a missing environmental impact appendix, the kind of deficiencies that existed in the accession files of at least 9 other signatory species, none of whom had been reclassified. But the technical grounds served their purpose. They gave the decision the appearance of process rather than politics. I had not been part of that vote. I had been assigned to mineral rights arbitration on the outer threshold at the time, reviewing water table claims between 2 species I no longer remember. When I returned to Vethon Station and found the reclassification in the case archive, I read it with the same detached interest I read everything as a matter of record. The humans had been reclassified. The file was closed. I moved on. 8 years passed. The galaxy adjusted. The trade lanes that had connected human colony worlds to the broader network were rerouted or decommissioned. The joint scientific programs that had included human researchers were restructured without them. The humanitarian aid corridors that had supplied medical technology to Earth's outer settlements were classified as low priority and allowed to lapse. The colony on Mercer's landing 40,000 humans on a world at the edge of Commission space, lost access to the pharmaceutical exchange, and spent 3 years synthesizing critical medications from local compounds before their biochemists stabilized the process. The settlement on Hadfield Station lost its atmospheric maintenance contract and had to renegotiate independently with a private Velori firm at 4 times the previous rate. 17 human researchers were removed from the Keithrani Deep Space Survey program, and the program's productivity dropped 11% the following cycle, a fact noted in an internal report and attributed to scheduling adjustments. None of this was dramatic. None of it made headlines in the Commission press feeds. No one protested. No one objected. No delegation raised a formal complaint on humanity's behalf, because the reclassification had been ratified by the full body, and the full body's decisions, by definition, reflected the collective will. The logic was circular and self-sealing, the way institutional logic always is when the institution does not want to examine itself. It was simply the slow, administrative process of a civilization being erased from the systems that had once included it, not with violence, but with the quiet efficiency of a bureaucracy that had decided a species no longer mattered enough to accommodate. Then the petition arrived, and because I had no prior involvement in the reclassification, and because the Commission's conflict of interest protocols required an arbiter with clean hands, case 4417 landed on my docket. The petition was 11 pages. I read it in the time it took to drink a cup of Ricard. It was written in standard galactic, grammatically precise, with no emotional language and no rhetorical embellishment. It requested a formal hearing to challenge the reclassification on procedural grounds. It cited 7 provisions of the Commission's own founding charter. It named no individuals. It made no accusations. It asked only for what the charter promised, the right to be heard. I approved the hearing because the charter required me to. Not because I believed it would matter. The petition would be heard, the procedural record would be completed, the finding would confirm the original reclassification, and the file would be closed with the proper stamps and notations that transformed a political decision into an administrative inevitability. I had seen it 100 times. The system was not designed to reverse itself. It was designed to process, and processing always ended the same way. That was my first error. The hearing convened on the 31st day of the 6th cycle, in Chamber 7 of the Hall of Arbitration. Chamber 7 was the smallest of the Commission's hearing rooms, a deliberate assignment. The humans had requested the Grand Arbitration Hall, which seated 1,800. The scheduling office had placed them in Chamber 7, which seated 94. When I queried the scheduling clerk about the discrepancy, she checked her records, paused, and informed me that the Grand Hall was reserved for proceedings of commission-wide significance. A species-level petition from a reclassified polity did not qualify. I asked whether a species-level petition had ever before been classified as less than commission-wide significance. She could not find a precedent. She offered to file an escalation request. I told her Chamber 7 would be sufficient. I did not challenge the assignment, I should have, but at the time it struck me as proportionate. The petition was a formality. It deserved a formal room. Chamber 7 was formal enough. I arrived early. I always arrive early. The chamber was a shallow amphitheater, curved tiers of brushed steel seats wrapping a half-circle around a central floor. The ceiling was a latticed glass dome, the standard Commission design, letting in the pale amber light of Vethon's sun. Through the glass, the orbital docking ring was visible, the gray silhouettes of Commission patrol vessels and trade haulers against a bright sky streaked with cirrus clouds. The walls were pale stone paneled with recessed holographic displays, currently dark. The floor was polished composite that reflected the dome light upward, making the chamber feel larger than its 94 seats warranted. 12 of those seats were occupied when I took my position at the arbiter's bench. 8 Droshari delegates from the original reclassification committee, present as observers, their attendance technically voluntary, but in practice a show of institutional solidarity. 2 Velori trade representatives with data pads already open, their narrow gray faces professionally neutral. A Keithrani legal attaché with no filed reason to attend, which I noted and set aside. And 1 seat in the front row, on the human side of the aisle, where a woman sat alone. Her name was Renata Saldana. She was 53 years old, according to the filing. Tall for a human, lean, with gray-streaked dark hair cut short above her collar. She wore a plain dark suit, no insignia, no decorations, no diplomatic sash, nothing to indicate rank or office or affiliation. Her hands were folded in her lap. She sat upright, perfectly still, and she was looking at me. Not at the chamber, not at the delegates, not at the dome or the empty displays or the vast expanse of brushed steel and pale stone that dwarfed her. At me, steady, patient, without expectation, without challenge, just attention. The focused, unhurried attention of someone who had traveled a very long way to be in this room and intended to use every minute of it. It was an unsettling experience. I had presided over hearings with delegations of 40, with armed escorts, with holographic evidence arrays filling the chamber floor and legal teams arguing in 3 languages simultaneously. I had never been looked at by a single person sitting alone in a near-empty room, and felt the weight of it quite like that. I adjusted my arbiter's console, a brushed steel surface embedded in the bench, its holographic interface dim and waiting, and called the session to order. Case 4417, I said. Terran petition for review of reclassification order 1162 Vethon, filed under Article 29 of the Founding Charter. The petitioner may present her opening statement. Saldana stood. She did not approach the podium. There was one, centered on the floor, a raised platform with a microphone relay, but she remained at her seat and spoke from where she stood. Her voice was level, unhurried. It carried in the chamber's acoustics with a clarity that had nothing to do with volume. Adjudicator Thien, members of the Commission. 8 years ago, this body voted to strip Earth of its signatory protections. The vote was conducted in closed session. Earth's delegation was not notified. No opportunity to respond was provided before, during, or after the proceeding. The petition before you does not ask this commission to reverse the reclassification. It asks this commission to explain it. That was her entire opening statement, 51 words, delivered in a tone that carried no anger, no accusation, no plea. She sat down. The chamber was quiet. In the observer's tier, one of the Droshari delegates, Commissioner Hethal, I believe, though I would need to check the seating chart, made a note on his data pad. I saw him glance at the delegate beside him and tap a single glyph, the Droshari shorthand for brief. Whether he meant the statement or the proceeding, I do not know. At the time, I assumed the latter. The Valori trade representatives exchanged a look, the quick narrowing of the eyes and micro-inclination of the head that serves as the Valori equivalent of a shrug. One of them scrolled his data pad to a different document. The other set hers down entirely. Their body language said what I was thinking. This would not take long. I checked my procedural notes. In 32 years, I had never received an opening statement that short. I was not sure whether it was a tactic or a failure of preparation. At the time, I assumed the latter. A species that had been locked out of diplomatic channels for 8 years, representing itself with a single unaided advocate in a chamber designed to hold cargo disputes. It was not unreasonable to assume they simply did not know how this worked. That was my second error. The Commission acknowledges the opening statement, I said. The respondent, the Commission's delegation on behalf of the original reclassification panel, may reply. Senior Commissioner Drothal rose from the observer's tier. He was old. Even by Droshari standards, his cranial spines had dulled to a pale ivory, and his primary arms moved with the careful deliberation of someone managing joint calcification. His formal robes were dark charcoal with silver threading at the shoulders, the rank markers of a commissioner who had served through 3 arbitration cycles. He had been on the original reclassification panel. He was the only member who had agreed to represent the Commission's position in this hearing. The others had declined, citing scheduling conflicts that I suspected were diplomatic rather than logistical. The reclassification of Earth's signatory status followed established procedure, Drothal said. His voice was steady, practiced, the voice of someone who had spoken with institutional authority so many times that authority had become habit rather than something earned. The grounds were documented. The vote was lawful. This petition represents a misunderstanding of the Commission's jurisdictional framework, and we respectfully recommend its dismissal." He sat down. The other Droshari observers clicked their approval, a soft, rhythmic tapping of spinal plates against seat backs, the involuntary social response signaling consensus, a body affirming what it already believed. I looked at Saldana. She was watching Drothal with an expression I could not read. Not anger, not surprise, something patient and very still, like a person watching water approach a particular mark on a wall and knowing exactly when it will arrive. "Petitioner," I said, "you may respond." She stood again. "Commissioner Drothal states the reclassification followed established procedure. I would like to ask him one question." I glanced at Drothal. He inclined his head, the Droshari grant of permission. His obsidian eyes were steady. He was not concerned. He had fielded procedural challenges for 4 decades. One human with one question was not going to trouble him. "Commissioner," Saldana said, "under Article 14, Section 3 of the Founding Charter, the provision governing status modification of any signatory species, is the affected species entitled to formal notification prior to the convening of the review panel?" Drothal's secondary arms twitched, a lateral flex of the mid-joints, barely visible beneath his robes. In Droshari physiology, it signals the moment the autonomic system detects a discrepancy before the conscious mind catches up. The body knows something is wrong half a second before the brain admits it. "The provision you cite," he said carefully, "applies to standard reclassification proceedings." Was Earth's reclassification a standard proceeding? It was conducted under the emergency review framework. Under what declared emergency? Silence. Drothal's spinal plates went still, the clicking stopped. The involuntary endorsement shut off like a switch thrown. Behind him, 2 of the observers exchanged a glance, a quick lateral sweep of the obsidian eyes. The Droshari whispered aside. One of them reached for his data pad and began scrolling through the archive with the urgency of someone who has just realized the answer to a question he has never asked may not be what he assumed. "The emergency framework," Drothal said, "was invoked by the presiding arbiter at the time, Adjudicator Veln, under his discretionary authority." Was Adjudicator Veln's invocation of the emergency framework documented in the session record? I would need to consult the archive. I have consulted it. Saldana reached into the interior pocket of her jacket and produced a data tablet, thin, unadorned, standard civilian issue. Not a diplomatic instrument, not a military device. The kind of tablet a schoolteacher might carry to a parent conference. The session record for the reclassification hearing, dated Cycle 42, Day 11, 8 years ago. I obtained it through a public records request filed 14 months ago, processed under Section 88 of the Commission's Transparency Protocol. She held the tablet at her side. She did not brandish it. She did not hold it up for dramatic effect. She simply held it, the way you hold a fact you have been carrying for a long time and have finally found the room where it belongs. I remember the exact moment because of what happened in the observer's tier. Commissioner Hethal, the one who had noted the brevity of the opening statement, stopped writing. His stylus froze mid-glyph. His obsidian eyes locked on the tablet in Saldana's hand, and then moved slowly to the holographic display panel on the wall, as though calculating how far the session record was from the chamber's archive terminal, and whether anyone could check her claim before she finished speaking. No one moved to check. The claim was either true or it was not, and something in the way Saldana held that tablet, the calm absence of performance, the stillness of someone who has verified a fact so many times that verification has become unnecessary, communicated that it was true. The session record contains no invocation of the emergency framework, no declaration of emergency. No documentation of the grounds for bypassing Article 14. The vote to reclassify Earth was conducted as a standard proceeding, but without the notification required by the standard proceeding's own rules. The clicking in the observer's tier stopped entirely. The silence that filled the chamber was not the comfortable quiet of a routine proceeding. It was the silence of a room in which every person was simultaneously recalculating. I sat very still. Beneath the cartilage plate that protects the Droshari cardiac cluster, I felt something I had not felt in years of arbitration, the cold, precise sensation of a procedural foundation shifting. Not because of what she was saying, because of what it meant for the record I was sitting on. The record I had read once, 8 years ago, and filed away without a second thought because it did not concern me. "Adjudicator," Saldana said, turning to face me directly. Her voice had not changed, the same level tone, the same unhurried cadence. "I am not asking this commission to feel sympathy for Earth. I am not asking for an apology. I am asking whether the commission's own charter was followed. If it was, show me where. If it was not, I am asking what this body intends to do about it." She sat down. The next 4 hours were the most difficult of my career. Not because of the arguments were surgical, methodical, and devastating in their restraint. Saldana did not raise her voice. She did not accuse anyone of malice. She did not appeal to emotion or invoke the suffering of the 18 human colony worlds severed from supply networks during the reclassification years. She did not mention the medical shortages on Mercer's Landing. She did not describe the 3 children who had died on Hadfield Station when the atmospheric maintenance system failed during the gap between the commission, contract's termination, and the private firm's activation. She did not mention them, and their absence from her arguments was louder than any accusation would have been. What she did was ask questions. She asked whether the quorum for the reclassification vote had been properly constituted. The charter required a minimum of 14 delegations physically present and voting for a species-level decision. I watched Drothal pull up the attendance record on the holographic display, the first time the chamber's systems had been activated during the hearing. 16 delegations had been listed as present, but Saldana produced the session's access logs, the security records of who had actually entered and exited the chamber obtained through the same transparency protocol. She displayed them beside the attendance record. The comparison took less than 30 seconds to read. 2 delegations listed as present had left the chamber before the vote was called. Their access badges had logged exit timestamps 11 minutes before the vote record was sealed. They had been counted as present for quorum purposes despite having physically departed. The required quorum was 14. The actual count was 12. Below threshold. I watched Drothal's face as this registered. The cranial spines flattened against his skull. The secondary arms drew inward against his torso. His primary hands, still folded in the gesture of judicial composure, pressed together until the knuckle joints whitened beneath the gray skin. A delegate in the 6th tier, a younger Droshari, one I did not recognize from the original panel, quietly pulled up his own copy of the access logs on his personal data pad. I saw his obsidian eyes widen. He rechecked. He rechecked again. Then he set the pad face down on his armrest and sat very still. He had just confirmed it for himself. Saldana moved on. She did not linger. She did not emphasize what she had just established. She treated it as one fact among several, and that restraint was more effective than any emphasis would have been. She asked whether the evidentiary standard for reclassification, the charter's requirement to demonstrate specific, documented material harm caused by the species in question, had been met. She produced the prosecution's original evidence brief and walked through it item by item, displaying each page on the holographic array beside the corresponding accession files of other signatory species. Earth's clerical errors were minor, a population figure rounded to the nearest million instead of the nearest 100,000. An environmental appendix filed under a slightly different classification code, but present in the archive. The Droshari client state of Vethal 3 had an accession file with an entire section missing the biological hazard assessment, listed as mandatory in the filing guidelines. It had never been flagged, never reviewed, never mentioned. The Velori Protectorate of Shen had self-reported population figures that differed from the Commission's own census by a factor of 3. It had never been questioned. The Rithani Collective had filed their accession in a deprecated format that technically rendered the entire document invalid under a rule change from decades past. No one had noticed. No one had looked. 6 species currently represented in this commission, Saldana said, standing at her seat with the holographic comparisons glowing behind her in parallel columns, have accession files with deficiencies equal to or greater than Earth's. None were reclassified. None were reviewed. None were notified that their files contained irregularities. She paused one beat. Earth was the only one. I watched the Velori trade representative on the left, a senior member of the bloc that had endorsed the reclassification, pull up the Shen accession file on his personal pad. His narrow face tightened. He scrolled to the population figures. His jaw worked once, the Velori equivalent of a wince, and he set the pad down. He had just confirmed that his own protectorate's file was worse than the one they had used to justify expelling a species. I called a recess, not because the proceedings required it, because I needed to walk the corridor outside Chamber 7 and stand in a space that was not filling with the weight of institutional failure. In the corridor, I passed 2 of the Droshari observers. They were speaking rapidly in the low-frequency register that Droshari use when they do not want to be overheard, their spinal plates pressed flat in the posture of acute professional distress. When they saw me, they stopped talking. One of them met my eyes and looked away, the Droshari break of contact. That means I have nothing I am prepared to say. I stood at the corridor window for 6 minutes, looking at the orbital traffic against the bright sky. A Velori cargo hauler was docking at the outer ring, its hull catching the light as it rotated into alignment. A commissioned patrol vessel was holding station at the perimeter, its running lights blinking the slow cadence of a ship on routine watch. The machinery of a functioning system, moving parts performing their assigned roles, and I stood there and thought about a concept that had never troubled me before. The difference between a system that is fair and a system that appears fair, because no one has tested it. I had spent 32 years inside a system I believed was fair, and Saldana had tested it in a single morning, and found that the fairness was a veneer, thin, untested, maintained not by integrity, but by the absence of anyone willing to look underneath. When I returned, Saldana was in her seat, same posture, same stillness. She had not moved during the recess. I later learned she had not eaten since the morning. The afternoon session was harder. Saldana began by returning to the evidentiary brief, the document the original panel had used to justify the reclassification. She had already demonstrated that the specific deficiencies cited in Earth's accession file existed in the files of 6 other species. Now she went further. The evidentiary brief submitted to the reclassification panel contains 4 categories of cited irregularity, she said. I would like to examine the 4th category, the one listed as failure to disclose military capability assessment. She displayed the relevant page. The brief stated that Earth's accession file had omitted a mandatory military capability disclosure, rendering the file incomplete and the accession potentially invalid. Section 77 of the accession protocol requires a military capability disclosure from any species maintaining a standing defense force at the time of application, Saldana said. Earth's accession file includes this disclosure. It is filed under Section 77A, the subsection for species with distributed rather than centralized command structures. The original panel's evidentiary brief states the disclosure was missing. It was not missing. It was filed under a different subsection than the one the panel's staff checked. She displayed both documents side by side, the evidentiary brief claiming the disclosure was absent, and the disclosure itself, complete, signed, and time-stamped 4 days before Earth's original accession hearing. A sound moved through the chamber, not the clicking of Dross-Hari approval. Something lower, the involuntary Dross-Hari exhalation that signals cognitive distress, a rush of air through the secondary respiratory passages that the body produces when a fundamental assumption collapses. 90 people exhaling at once. The Vellore trade representative on the right, the junior member of the pair, leaned to his colleague and spoke in a register I could not hear. Whatever he said, the senior representative's narrow face went pale. He pulled up the evidentiary brief on his own pad, scrolled to the 4th category, and stared at it for 11 seconds without moving. Drothal had not spoken in 20 minutes. His eyes were open but fixed on the middle distance, the obsidian surfaces reflecting the holographic display without registering it. I had seen that expression once before, on the face of a trade commissioner who had been informed that the contract he had ratified contained a clause that invalidated his own delegation's jurisdiction. It is the expression of a professional who has discovered that the edifice he helped build has a structural flaw in its foundation, and that everyone is now looking at it. Saldana moved on without emphasis. She treated each violation the same way, presented it, sourced it, let it register, and moved to the next. The restraint was extraordinary. A lesser advocate would have lingered, would have underlined, would have turned to the gallery and let the moment build. Saldana did none of that. She simply laid facts end to end, like stones in a path, and trusted the room to walk it. She then asked whether the impact assessment required under Article 22 had been conducted before the reclassification vote. I need to explain what Article 22 is, because its absence is not merely a procedural technicality. It is the provision that separates a deliberative body from a tribunal. Article 22 was written into the Charter by the Commission's founders 400 years ago. The founders had understood something that their successors had forgotten, that stripping a species of its protections is not an abstract administrative action. It is a decision that reaches through the institutional architecture and touches real populations, real supply chains, real medical systems, real atmospheric contracts, real children in real schools on real colony worlds who will wake up one morning and discover that the systems their lives depend on no longer recognize them. The impact assessment was designed to make that cost visible before the vote, so that every delegate who raised a hand in favor would do so knowing exactly what they were voting for. The assessment was supposed to quantify the affected population, the number of colony worlds, the trade volume that would be disrupted, the humanitarian corridors that would close, the research programs that would lose personnel, the medical exchanges that would terminate. Every consequence itemized, reviewed, and entered into the record so that the decision could be made in full knowledge of its weight. It was the Charter's insistence that power acknowledge its consequences. The session record contained no impact assessment, no mention of one. No evidence that the requirement had been discussed, deferred, waived, or acknowledged in any form. The reclassification had been proposed, debated for 35 minutes, and voted on in a single session. 40 minutes, start to finish, for a decision that would affect 18 colony worlds and 700 million people. Saldana did not editorialize. She displayed the relevant charter provision on the holographic array, then displayed the session record beside it, and let the absent speak. The two documents glowed side by side in the amber light, one prescribing what was supposed to happen, the other showing what did, and the gap between them was visible to everyone in the room. On one side, the Charter's precise language, a comprehensive assessment of consequences for the affected species' civilian population shall be completed, reviewed by the arbitration division, and entered into the session record prior to any vote on status modification. On the other side, the session record from 8 years ago, 35 minutes of debate, a quorum count, and a vote. Nothing between the debate and the vote. No assessment, no review, no entry. No acknowledgement that 700 million people existed on the other side of the decision. She let the display hold for 15 seconds before continuing. In those 15 seconds, I watched 3 Droshari delegates reach for their personal data pads. I watched the Keithrani attaché's stylus stop moving. I watched Drothal close his eyes, a gesture I had never seen from him, and one that in Droshari body language does not mean rest. It means the visual field has become unbearable. Then Saldana produced one more document, a copy of an internal audit commissioned 18 months after the reclassification by the Commission's own compliance office and never published. The audit had identified the quorum discrepancy. It had flagged the missing emergency framework documentation. It had noted the absent impact assessment, and it had recommended corrective action, a formal review of the reclassification to determine whether it should be upheld or vacated. The corrective action had been logged in the Commission's administrative system as deferred pending prioritization review. The prioritization review had never been scheduled. The audit itself had been filed in the restricted archive accessible through the transparency protocol, but only if you knew it existed and knew how to request it. Saldana had known. She had requested it. She had read it. And now she displayed it on the holographic array beside the other documents. 18 months of institutional self-knowledge that had been acknowledged, documented, and buried, because acknowledging it publicly would have required the Commission to admit that it had made a mistake, and the Commission had not been ready to admit that. The chamber shifted. I could feel it, not a physical movement, but a change in the quality of attention, the way light changes when a cloud moves. The Droshari observers were no longer clicking their approval. 2 of them had begun checking their own involvement in the original reclassification, reviewing their votes with the retrospective clarity of people who have just realized those records might be read by someone willing to hold them to account. One of them, the younger delegate who had checked the access logs, was looking at Saldana with an expression I recognized. I had seen it on the faces of junior arbiters when they watch a senior practitioner execute a proceeding at a level they had not known was possible. It was respect, and it was involuntary, and it was the most dangerous thing that could happen to a body trying to maintain its confidence. Then Saldana asked her final question. Commissioner Drothal, Adjudicator Thien, members of the Commission, I have documented procedural violations in the quorum, the evidentiary standard, the notification requirement, and the impact assessment. I have presented the Commission's own internal audit confirming these violations. I have one remaining question. She stood. Her hands were at her sides. Her voice was the same as it had been at the start level, unhurried, carrying with the weight of something assembled slowly and delivered once. Can anyone in this chamber identify the specific harm that Earth caused the Commission? Not the clerical irregularities, not the paperwork, the actual harm, the incident, the act, the threat, the grievance that led 18 species to strip a 19th of its protections in a closed session lasting 40 minutes. What did we do? No one answered. I looked at Drothal. He was looking at the floor, not the defiant stare-down of a man who disagrees. The lowered gaze of someone who has been asked a question he cannot answer and knows that the inability to answer is itself the answer. I looked at the observer's tier. The younger Droshari delegate who had been checking the access logs had his hands flat on his armrests, his spinal plates pressed so tight they had disappeared entirely into the musculature of his back. The Velori senior representative had taken off his translation earpiece and was holding it in his hand, turning it slowly between his fingers, the way you hold an object when you need something physical to anchor you while your understanding of the world rearranges itself. The Keithrani attaché had stopped writing. Her stylus rested on the page, and she was looking at Saldana with an expression that I would later understand, was the look of someone who has just watched history happen and knows it. The silence held for 8 seconds. I counted. Saldana sat down. I looked at her from the arbiter's bench, 53 years old, a schoolteacher. Sitting alone in a chamber designed to make one person feel insignificant, surrounded by the institutional weight of 18 species and 400 years of accumulated authority, and she had just asked the only question that mattered and received the only answer that could confirm her case. No answer at all. I called the evening recess. In my office, I pulled the original reclassification file. I had read it once 8 years ago with the professional disinterest I applied to everything that crossed my desk. A closed matter, an archived decision. Not my case, not my concern. I had not questioned it because the system that produced it was the system I served, and the system did not produce errors, it produced decisions, and decisions, by definition, were correct. Now I read it again, slowly, every page, every procedural notation, every signature block, every timestamp. It was worse than Saldana had described, not because she had understated the violations, she had been precise. It was worse because the violations were so ordinary. No conspiracy, no corruption, no secret meetings in darkened rooms, just the casual negligence of a body that had decided what it wanted and then found the paperwork to justify it afterward. A quorum counted wrong because no one bothered to verify the access logs. An emergency framework invoked verbally and never documented because the presiding arbiter assumed someone else would handle it. An impact assessment skipped because the species in question was small, new, and did not have enough allies in the chamber to insist on one. An internal audit that identified the problems, recommended fixes, and was filed in an archive where it would never be seen. I had seen this before, not with reclassifications, those were rare, but with minor procedural shortcuts in trade disputes and border cases. A deadline extended without documentation. A notification sent to a defunct address and counted as delivered. An evidentiary threshold relaxed because the outcome was obvious and the formality seemed unnecessary. The kind of institutional carelessness that accumulates in the gaps between what the rules require and what the practitioners consider necessary. I had never objected to it. I had never flagged it. I had never noticed it as a pattern, because the pattern only becomes visible when you are willing to look, and I had not been willing. Saldana had been willing. In 8 years of exile with no diplomatic access, no legal representation, no research staff, and no allies, she had filed records requests through the Commission's own transparency protocol, working alone from a civilian terminal. She had cross-referenced charter provisions with session records. She had obtained access logs that no one had thought to classify because no one had imagined anyone would examine them. She had requested the buried audit. And she had assembled all of it patiently, methodically, over years, into a case so thorough that it did not need to accuse anyone of anything. It simply held the Commission's own rules up to the Commission's own actions and let the gap speak for itself. I drafted the preliminary finding that night, 12 pages. It documented each procedural violation, confirmed it against the Charter, and concluded that the reclassification had been conducted in material violation of the Commission's foundational protocols. It recommended immediate restoration of provisional status and the convening of a full re-review panel. I transmitted it to the Central Archive at 22:47 station time. The acknowledgement came back in 4 seconds. The first query from the Internal Affairs Office came in 9 minutes. The first informal communication from a senior delegate, unsigned, untraceable, advising me to consider the institutional implications before proceeding, arrived in 22 minutes. I filed all of it in the active evidence folder. I did not sleep that night. Not because I was afraid. Fear is a sharp, immediate thing, and what I felt was not sharp. It was the slow, grinding weight of a career's worth of assumptions being dismantled by a woman with a civilian data tablet and a schoolteacher's patience. I sat at my desk and I read the charter, the entire charter, all 412 provisions from the preamble to the final amendment. I had administered it for 32 years. I had never read it straight through. In 32 years of applying its rules to other species disputes, I had never once sat with the document and asked myself what it was trying to be. It was trying to be fair. That was the founding intention, clear in the language of every provision, the architecture of every safeguard. And it had become something else not through malice, but through the accumulated indifference of practitioners like me who had applied its rules without caring whether they worked. 2 more unsigned communications arrived before dawn, one from a Valori diplomatic address. The bloc is convening an emergency caucus. 3 delegations are reconsidering their original vote. Another from within the Commission's own administrative bureau, the office that had issued the Minimize Visibility Directive. The directive referenced in today's hearing was issued at the request of Senior Commissioner Drothal's office. This communication is for the arbiter's records only. I filed them all. The next morning when I entered Chamber 7, the room was different. Not the 12 observers, not 94 seats sparsely filled. Every seat was occupied. Commission staff lined the walls, archivists in pale blue tunics, legal clerks with data pads open, translators wearing the silver earpieces of the multilingual service, administrative officers who had no procedural reason to be present, but who had come because news of the preliminary finding had traveled through the station overnight the way it does in any institution when the institution discovers it has made a mistake it cannot quietly bury. The grand arbitration hall had not been made available, but Chamber 7 was full, and the overflow stood in the corridor outside with the doors propped open, watching on relayed holographic feeds. Over 300, more than 3 times the chamber's capacity. Saldana was in the same seat, same suit, same posture. If she was surprised by the size of the audience, she did not show it. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was looking at the glass dome, where the morning light came through in broad amber shafts and caught the dust motes drifting in the still air. Through the dome, 3 human cruisers had appeared in the station's orbital vicinity sometime during the night, heavy gray hulls in a loose triangle formation, holding position in the bright sky. No one had mentioned them. Their presence was not in the proceedings. But everyone could see them through the glass, silent and motionless against the pale morning, and the message required no words. I called the session to order. The arbiter's preliminary finding has been transmitted to the Commission archive and is now part of the public record. The finding identifies material procedural violations in reclassification, Order 1162 Vethon. The Commission's rules of procedure require that a preliminary finding of this nature be presented to the full arbitration panel for confirmation or rejection within 1 session cycle. I paused. The chamber was silent in a way I had never heard it, not the bored silence of routine, but the held-breath silence of a body confronting itself. Before the panel deliberates, the petitioner is entitled to a closing statement. Saldana stood. She looked at the chamber, the packed tiers, the standing observers, the feeds carrying her image through the station. Then she looked at me. Adjudicator Thien. When I filed this petition 14 months ago, I was told it would be rejected at intake. When it was accepted, I was told the hearing would be procedural and brief, a courtesy, not a genuine review. When I arrived on Vethon Station, I was given a chamber designed for cargo disputes and a schedule that allotted me less time than the Commission grants to border marking disagreements between uninhabited moons. She paused. The chamber did not move. I came anyway, not because I expected to win, because the charter says I have the right to be heard, and I wanted to know if that was true. She turned slightly, taking in the room. 8 years ago, this body decided that Earth was not worth the effort of following its own rules. The reclassification was not about our accession file. Everyone in this chamber knows that. It was about convenience. We were new. We were small. We did not have allies on the senior council, and it was easier to remove us than to accommodate us. No anger, no accusation, no raised voice, just the flat, steady delivery of a fact that everyone in the room already knew and no one had ever been required to say aloud. I am not asking you to feel guilty about that. Institutions make decisions based on interest, and 8 years ago our exclusion served this body's interests. I understand that. What I am asking is simpler. She looked at me. I am asking whether this commission is the institution its charter says it is. Whether the rules written into its foundation apply to every species that signs them, or only to the species powerful enough to enforce them. Whether a single person, standing alone in a room full of people who decided 8 years ago that she did not matter, can hold this body to its own promises. She let that settle. That is my closing statement. She sat down. I have thought about that moment many times since. Not the words were clear, precise, unanswerable, but the quality of the silence that followed. The particular stillness of delegates and staff and corridor observers, all of them looking at a single human woman who had not raised her voice, had not made threats, had not invoked the fleet visible through the dome, had not appealed to pity or rage or shame, who had simply read the rules, asked if they were real, and waited for the answer. I confirmed the preliminary finding. The full panel ratified it within the hour. The margin was not close. Several delegations that had participated in the original reclassification voted in favor of reversal. The Velori trade bloc, which had endorsed the reclassification 8 years earlier, voted unanimously for restoration. The Keithrani transmitted a formal endorsement from their home world before the vote was called. Even among the Droshari delegation, my own people, the species that had proposed the reclassification, 4 of the 8 observers voted to restore Earth status. Drothal abstained. He left the chamber without speaking, and I never saw him in the hall of arbitration again. Earth's provisional signatory status was restored effective immediately. The formal notification was transmitted to every human diplomatic station and colony world within the hour. The 3 human cruisers visible through Chamber 7's glass dome, the ones no one had mentioned throughout the hearing, the ones that had appeared in the night and held position in the bright morning sky without hailing the station or requesting docking clearance, adjusted their formation within minutes of the vote. They did not leave. They did not advance. They rotated 15 degrees in perfect synchronization, 3 hulls turning as one, a maneuver that in any naval doctrine means a vessel is presenting its broadside to a friendly port rather than its bow to a potential threat. The rotation took 40 seconds. Every delegate in the chamber watched it through the dome, and not one of them spoke. It was the naval equivalent of uncrossing your arms, a signal that the conversation had changed. I am told that on Mercer's Landing, when the notification arrived, the settlement's administrator read it over the public address system, and then stood at the podium in silence for half a minute while the square below him went quiet, and then, slowly, began to understand. The pharmaceutical exchange was reopened within 72 hours. The atmospheric maintenance contract on Hadfield Station was restored at the original rate within a week. The 17 researchers removed from the Keithrani survey program were invited to return. 14 of them did. The other 3 had found positions in Earth's independent research programs, the ones humanity had built during the 8 years when no one else would work with them. Saldana left the chamber the same way she had entered it, alone, quietly. She shook no hands. She made no statement to the press correspondents who had gathered in the corridor. She stopped briefly at the exit, turned back to the chamber, and inclined her head toward me, not a bow, not a salute, just the small, acknowledging nod of one professional to another. Then she walked to the docking ring, boarded a civilian transport, and departed Vethon Station. I learned later that she was not a diplomat, not a lawyer, not a government official of any kind. She was a retired schoolteacher from Mercer's Landing, one of the settlements that had been cut off from supply networks during the reclassification. She had spent 3 years filing records requests, working from a desk in her apartment with a standard civilian data terminal. 2 years studying the charter, provision by provision, cross-referencing it with every session record she could access. 1 year preparing the petition, and 2 weeks traveling to Vethon Station on a civilian ticket she had purchased with her personal savings. She had no authority, no credentials, no allies, no staff, no legal training, no diplomatic experience. She had only the charter and the belief that the rules meant what they said. I made inquiries afterward through unofficial channels. The Human Diplomatic Service had not sent her. The colony administration on Mercer's Landing had not funded her travel. No government office had reviewed her petition before she filed it. She had done it alone, on her own initiative, because she had looked at what had happened to her world and decided that someone should ask whether it was supposed to happen that way. Not someone powerful, not someone credentialed, just someone willing. That is the thing about humans that the Commission did not understand, and that I did not understand until Renata Saldana walked into Chamber 7. They do not wait for permission to hold you accountable. They do not need authority to invoke your own rules. They will sit at a desk on a colony world at the edge of your jurisdiction, with a civilian terminal and a copy of your charter, and they will read every word of it. And then they will come to your house and ask you if you meant it. I resigned from the Commission 6 months later. Not in protest, the restoration proceeded as ordered, and the re-review panel assembled with full transparency. I resigned because I could no longer pretend that my 32 years of careful, procedural, dispassionate arbitration had been neutral. I had been indifferent. There is a difference, and Renata Saldana taught me what it was. Neutrality is a position. Impartiality is a discipline. Indifference is neither. Indifference is the bias of the comfortable, the assumption that the system works because it has always worked for you, and the quiet willingness to look away when it fails for someone else. It does not announce itself. It does not feel like a choice. It feels like nothing, which is precisely why it is so dangerous. The arbiter who looks away does not believe he is complicit. He believes he is uninvolved. And that belief is the mechanism by which institutions fail, not through the corruption of the powerful, but through the inaction of the competent. I had looked away for 8 years, not out of malice, not out of corruption, out of convenience, the same convenience that had driven the reclassification itself. I had been part of the problem not because I had done anything wrong, but because I had done nothing at all. The Commission published the re-review findings 9 months after the hearing. Earth's accession file was confirmed as valid. The original reclassification was formally vacated. A new provision was added to the Charter, Article 29A, informally known as the Saldana Provision, requiring that any future status modification of a signatory species be preceded by mandatory notification, a public hearing with the affected species present, and an independent impact assessment reviewed by a neutral arbiter. The provision passed unanimously. Not one delegation objected. I keep a copy of the hearing transcript in my quarters, not the official archive version, my personal notes, the ones I wrote during the recesses when my hands were steady enough to hold a stylus. On the cover, I wrote something Saldana said during the 3rd hour of the first day, in response to a question from Drothal about why Earth had waited 8 years to file the petition. She said, "We didn't wait, we prepared." Drothal had asked the question expecting it to land as an accusation. Why had Earth let 8 years pass before challenging a decision that had cost them so much? The implication was that the delay proved the petition was not serious, that a species truly wronged would have acted immediately. Saldana's answer turned the question inside out. The delay was not evidence of resignation. It was evidence of intent. I think about that line often, the patience of it, the discipline. 8 years of silence, not because they had nothing to say, but because they wanted to say it once, clearly, with the evidence in hand, and never need to say it again. That is what the commission learned about humans that day. Not that they are powerful. Not that they are angry. Not that they are dangerous. That they are patient. That they prepare. That they believe in rules even when the rules have been used against them. And that when they walk into a room alone, unarmed, with nothing but a charter and the expectation that it means what it says, they are the most formidable thing in the galaxy. The Saldana provision has been invoked twice since its adoption. Both times the affected species was notified. Both times a public hearing was convened. Both times the impact assessment was completed before the vote. The system did not become perfect. Systems never do. But it became watched, and watched systems behave differently than unwatched ones. That was Saldana's lasting contribution, not the restoration of Earth's status, which could have been reversed by any future vote, but the watching. She made the commission aware that someone might read its records, might check its procedures, might walk into a small chamber with a civilian tablet and ask the one question the institution had been designed to never have to answer. I am no longer a jurist. I teach arbitration law now at the Commission's Academy on Vethon Station. I begin every course the same way. I hand my students the transcript of Case 4417 and tell them to read it, all of it. Then I ask them a single question. When this woman walked into Chamber 7, alone, with no credentials, no allies, and no authority beyond a charter provision that had not been invoked in 40 years, who in this room would have listened? They never answer right away. The silence stretches. Some of them shift in their seats. Some of them look down at the transcript. Some of them look at me, searching for the answer in my expression, and find nothing because the answer is not in my expression. It is in theirs. I let the silence hold. It is the most important part of the lesson.